Where's the German media on Nord Stream, for example? Here, a major piece of infrastructure was blown up, I believe most likely by the United States or the UK, but on the Western side, quiet, silence. When I said this on American television, I was immediately cut off. But then, by the way, all of the circumstantial evidence points in that way. Sweden, incredibly, says, okay, we've investigated, but we're not going to share the results of our investigation with Germany. Members of the Bundestag ask, we want to know the facts. The German government says, no, you cannot know the facts. This is a security issue. We're supposed to take this? We call ourselves democracies? And this is the level of discourse? So the media really, I mean, look, there's a lot of media and you're part of it and it's great. We're having a wonderful open discussion and points of view that are very hard to express actually in the mainstream. But this mainstream media has lost its way. I can't tell you how disappointed I am every day in the New York Times.
What I've done is simply explain the obvious. It just was a story that was begging to be told. In late September, 2022, 8 bombs were supposed to go off. 6 went off under the water in near Bornholm Island in the Baltic Sea, in an area where rather shallow area. And they destroyed three of the 4 major pipelines, the Nord Stream 1 and 2, feeding gas forever, for many years at great low discounts. And so the meeting was convened to study the problem. What are we going to do? Russia's going to go to war. How can we? This is 3 months before the war. And it was the CIA and the National Security Agency, the State Department and the Treasury Department. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had a representation. And this is a secret group. They were meeting in the most secret, they were meeting in a very secret offices. And this is, I'm writing this obviously from inside. Do you want us to give you recommendations about what to do about stopping Russia that are reversible? More sanctions, economic pressure, we'd already been doing that, or irreversible? Irreversible being kinetic, bomb, bang, bang. Well, it was clear very early. I don't quite know how my old newspaper, the New York Times, how much longer they can pretend the story doesn't exist, because it's just irrational to do so.
The last 20 years, the US has walked away from arms control regimes and has broken the arms control regime entirely. With the unilateral withdrawal in 2019 by Donald Trump from the Intermediate Nuclear Missile Treaty, INF, there was a real sense that, look, the US is going to place intermediate nuclear missiles in Ukraine, just, few minutes launch time to landing to Moscow. The Chinese are afraid that if the US does this in Taiwan, the Chinese fear that in South Korea, President Yoon, who's a kind of Trump-like figure, has said we can put missiles in South Korea, in Taiwan, and so on. The Chinese also fear that because the US has walked out of the INF treaty. So in that sense, this has really destabilized the world. And I'm interested that in a country like Germany, the debate is so much around Ukraine and Russia that these broader points, these broader issues are not really part of the general political discussion, which would, I think, enable people to have a much wider and deeper understanding of the issues that are taking place in and around Ukraine.
Here's our record as a nation when it comes to a rules-based international order or authoritarian government or large countries invading small countries, all of that kind of talk that what you just said refers to. The United States invaded Korea, it's a small country. The United States invaded Vietnam, it's a small country. The United States invaded Afghanistan. It's one of the poorest countries on the face of the earth and a small country. The United States invaded Iraq. I could go on, in Libya and so forth. We have a history as a nation if there are rules-based international order, then the rule that we can identify is the United States does what it wants to do in the last 75 years, and either the United Nations goes along or it doesn't, but it doesn't really matter. And people like me who are close to the American government in terms of my personal life and my personal friendships, it doesn't enter into their mind. Therefore, suddenly, to be outraged when another country, big country, relatively, invades a small one, relatively, to be all excited about taking moral positions, wow, that requires a level of blindness and gullibility and one-sidedness that's a little embarrassing to witness, let alone to repeat.
They have to create a binary narrative of between good and evil. You know, everybody we fight, whether it's Saddam Hussein or Vladimir Putin, becomes the new Hitler. The Ukrainians become the angels or the defenders of liberty and democracy. This is a cartoon vision, of course, of what's happening. But this happens in every conflict. But I think it's especially important for those who are prosecuting the war to maintain that narrative because we're not directly involved in Ukraine. And at a certain point, especially with the economic suffering that is afflicting Europe and, to a lesser extent, the United States, people are going to ask, why are we pumping all this money into Ukraine? We've given more money to Ukraine, the United States, than we spend on the State Department, annual budget of the State Department. And so I think that there's special vigilance in terms of shutting down voices. But, you know, this is taking that conflict out of context. But it's the equivalent of accusing somebody who talks about the Versailles Treaty and the onerous reparations that were imposed on Germany as leading or causing the rise of fascism as being a fascist. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, if we don't understand how these processes work, then we're not going to prevent a crisis from happening.
It's very easy to think of scenarios that could lead on to nuclear war. So far, Russia has not attacked supply lines, the supply lines that are bringing in massive supplies to Ukraine. Actually, Western analysts have wondered why they're not doing it. Well, sooner or later they might do it. In that case, they run into a conflict with NATO. At that point, your imagination can move very quickly up the escalation ladder. Again, there are two ways to deal with that. One way is violence, what comes naturally to the United States and its allies. The other way is negotiation and diplomacy. Well, what do we see? 100% talk about escalating violence.
We oppose the division of the world in competing blocs that invest in rampant militarism, hyper-modern weapons of mass destruction, and a new Cold War. We believe that lasting peace can be achieved only by replacing all military blocs with an inclusive international security framework that de-escalates tensions, expands freedoms, fights poverty, limits exploitation, pursues social and environmental justice, and terminates the domination of one country by another. With these thoughts in mind, we call upon Democrats across the world to join forces in a new non-aligned movement as a route to lasting peace and globally shared prosperity.
We need to basically move from a militarized world of international relations to a demilitarized, humanized world of international relations if we're going to get out of here alive. But we can do that, and if we can get the tools of the military-industrial complex, the economic and political elites on all sides of the conflict, get them out of the position of calling the shots here. and let's put people, planet, and peace, back in charge.
Back in March, again, this was a negotiation that was mediated by Erdogan. The Ukrainians and the Russians were on the verge of a peace deal. What happened? According to the Ukrainian media, Boris Johnson went to Kiev and told Zelensky that, first of all, the West would not support a peace deal with Russia. This peace deal, by the way, did not involve, as far as I could tell, based on reports, Ukraine ceding the Donbass to Russia, or Kherson, or Zaporozhye, or Luhansk. What it did involve was a guarantee of neutrality. That was the focus of the deal. It is a much better deal than Ukraine could probably get now, and yet the British and the Americans tanked it. They promised Ukraine, at the same time they were saying they wouldn't support it, they promised Ukraine massive deliveries of weaponry, and ultimately they are the ones who killed the negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. And now the reality is that Ukraine could probably not do a deal as favorable as that one. I can't imagine that the Russians, after the losses they've sustained and the cost they've incurred, would be willing simply to march out of the areas they now control. There have to be some territorial concessions. And this is something that I think is a price that ought to be paid for the simple reason that it is the humane thing to do. Ukrainian lives will be saved. You can begin reconstructing the country. In the long run, perhaps these areas can become reintegrated to some degree, the areas that Russia now controls, with the other parts of Ukraine. At least some kind of a free trade deal, an open border. These are things that are absolutely essential. And to say to the Russians, we won't even sit at the table with you until you overthrow a government that is supported by some 80% of the Russian people, or until you withdraw all of your troops from Ukraine, is a recipe for no peace deal at all. We should be sitting down at the table without preconditions imposed on either side. And let's see where these talks lead us. And at the end of the day, if they fail, and if the Russians prove themselves to be unreasonable and unwilling to negotiate, well, at least we can say we tried. But we haven't even tried, Zane. And given the costs and the suffering that Ukraine is incurring, we should at least make a good faith.